get my glasses.
I'd like to take just a moment of your time to welcome you here this afternoon. We've invited several folks to join us, and some of them have made it already, and there'll be others coming in as we move along this afternoon. This morning we had an emphasis on meeting with our merchants in Hamilton and kind of giving some pointers from NaviRetail's perspective is what might help them in their shops to have a more presentable product, or to know their customer better, and to actually have a better interaction with the customer, as well as providing hours that are suitable for that customer to come and shop with them. So a lot of information was passed out this morning, but this 1 o'clock session today is dedicated to the developer landowners in Hamilton that are trying to promote good things through your ownership of property and having commercial buildings available, just in case that right business should show up to be housed in your facilities, or to build a facility on your property. So we've engaged with NaviRetail, the city has, and we're partnering to try to locate new retail in Hamilton, and also to give added support to the existing businesses that already do business here in Hamilton. After all, any business that comes to Hamilton helps Hamilton by providing new tax base so we can do better services for the people and offer more to our people who live here. And the whole emphasis, in my opinion, of Hamilton is that we still need to grow some. I feel like that even though we're 7,000 strong, that there'd be a real need for us to get to 10,000, and then some magic things happen. When you hit a 10,000 threshold in a city like Hamilton, others take notice of your size. They want to come and be a part. So it's urgent that we grow Hamilton from 7,000 to 10,000 people. It's going to take everybody working hard together to make this happen. But my vision is not to sit here and shrink and become a community of people that are going to die and go away and evaporate our population. We need to bring new families here to raise their children, to put them in school here. We've got a fabulous opportunity with our great schools, the middle school, elementary, and high school, all providing quality education, and we're still focused on the right thing for our children. And I just feel like that this partnership that we've put together with NaviRetail is going to be fruitful for our future. Casey is a native of Mississippi. He stays mostly in his corporate offices areas now. I know that travels throughout the United States developing new business and new partnerships. But Dallas is his headquarters, along with Memphis, and he's strictly a man on the go, and he's got so many contacts that we're dependent on to come and help us grow here in Hamilton. So I'm going to turn it over to Casey. I appreciate each one of you that have come this afternoon. I think it'll be a worthy experience for you, and I know the city is trying to do good things through these people, and we've already seen some proof that they're good folks and live up to their word. This is a first for us, as a seminar like this, and we hoped it would be a great success. We didn't have a lot of people attend from the merchants part this morning, but many of them don't have any help to leave in the shop. They have to operate their own businesses, so I can understand why everybody couldn't turn loose and come. But we're most delighted that you developers and landowners are here this afternoon for this session of the program. Casey.
Thank you, Mayor. So this will serve as an overview of the retail market here in Hamilton. Just to give you a little background about us and about myself, as Bob mentioned, I grew up in Pontotoc, Mississippi, thriving little town in northeast Mississippi, about 6,000 people, and believe me, I can relate to the struggles that a smaller town goes through, especially as far as development is concerned. I've been doing it about 10 years now. I started working for another firm that we now compete against back in 2012. And there's some things that we took from that and some things we made better. And one of the things we did right out of the gate is hosting events like this today so that we can ultimately connect with people that own property and that might be wanting to sell their property in the future for the purposes of retail development. What we like to do is, long before I've even talked to prospects and gotten interested parties to meet you all and be able to connect like we're doing today. That way, when I do have someone interested, the first time you're hearing from me is not, hey, I want to buy your land. It's, you know, you've known me. We've talked and had discussions prior. So when we enter a market, the first thing we look at is, do you know where your customers are coming from? And there's always varied responses, either from the businesses or from the city or even just people that live there. And so it's not that they're lacking responses, but they're lacking verifiable responses. And that is where we double down and use not only that feedback from the community, but also other means of getting that same information that we can verify. What we find is that most of them are not even living within the city limits of the towns that we're working in. And so that means that at some point in time, someone somewhere drove into a place like Hamilton and spent money. And we're able to see that. So you might ask, how do we do that? Thankfully now everyone's got this nice little device here, hopefully a little bit newer version than this one, but everyone has something with them that can be tracked now. And I don't want to go all Big Brother on you. It's creepy for me. The first thing I did is turn my phone off, delete all of this and that. But at any level, your phones now are just, they're being tracked. And so what we're able to see is where people are coming from and where they're going to, how long they were there, how many times they were there, and then ultimately how they spend money. And so this is something we've not had prior to about 6 years ago when we started. We were the first company out of the gate to use this type of technology for what we do. But it just didn't exist before. A lot of the methodologies before I even came up with one, when I worked for another company where we would go drive around a parking lot and get everyone's license plate number, and I built a system that would fetch that from a state database, which was generally pretty good, except we started working on the border of Texas and Mexico in McAllen, and half the license plates there were Mexican license plates. I didn't have a database for that. So then we were only capturing about 50% of the consumers in the market. And I said, well, there's got to be a better way to do this. And as it turns out, cell phones, everyone's got one, whether you're in Mexico or United States or Texas or Washington, everyone's got this device with them, and that's what we're using to do a lot of our research. So this shows kind of some of the raw data as it comes into us. It kind of looks like Easter eggs. It's also a little hard to see because of the lights, but what this represents is for the market that is Hamilton, everyone that came and spent dollars here, this is where they originated from. And so as you can imagine, with even like a gas station like Love's where people come from even other countries, some of these shipping containers, I don't know, I think sometimes there might be people in some of the shipping containers because we get some other countries in the mix. But what we want to see is just how far and wide everyone's coming from to be in Hamilton for whatever reason. And so what we do with that is we filter it down. And so we obviously don't want to take people, you know, that are from other countries and say that they're going to buy their groceries here. So when we do this filtering, we call this the retail trade area. So getting rid of people like me that are here just one day in a month, I'm obviously not going to be grocery shopping here, so we don't include me in this. But the ones that are frequent shoppers in the market get attributed to this retail trade area. For a market that is so diverse like Hamilton's, we have to break this down even further and then show what's called a primary retail trade area and a secondary retail trade area. And so what this is a difference of how likely someone is to make a purchase based on where they're originating from. And so obviously, if you're in the primary retail trade area, you're shopping here a lot. You're buying groceries here. If you're in what we call the secondary retail trade area, you have made purchases here, but you're not likely to be as frequent of a shopper. You're probably not buying groceries here. You might be in here, you know, once or twice a week, maybe once a week for a ball game, and you had dinner on your way out of town or something like that. So there's different scenarios that we encounter with how consumers spend money. But with this primary retail trade area, and I'll show it to you here, this represents where 95% of buyer propensity is ultimately the highest. And so basically, the people that live in this area are most likely frequently spend dollars in Hamilton. And I know it's hard to see, but a question I got asked this morning is, where's the state line? State line's right about there. And so it goes down to Sulligent, Winfield, all the way over the northwest to about the state line. And so these are people that you can count on day in and day out to patronize your business. If they were going to spend dollars in Hamilton, they are a primary customer. Like I said, 90 to 95% of buyer propensity, meaning the propensity for them to make a purchase is the highest if they originate from these areas. And as I mentioned, the secondary retail trade area is kind of a lesser version of that. So they're still coming here, they're still making purchases, but they may not buy their groceries once a week here. They may not buy, they may not be here every day. And so they become what we call the secondary retail trade area. And that's what this looks like here. And as you can see, it goes a little bit further, all the way over to Fulton, still got Winfield in there, Carbon Hill, Phil Campbell, Russellville, Red Bay. And so they may not be here every day, but to a degree, they're frequently in the community for one reason or another. We estimate that their buyer propensity is around 50 to 30%. So, when you look at the city's population, just over 7,000 after the 2020 census, we choose not to market this number, and here's why. Because we know that there are more people than 7,000 at any given time in the city limits of Hamilton that make purchases or can make a purchase. So when we sum all this up, we end up with what we call our total retail trade area. And this is the combination of those two trade areas that I just showed you. So, not saying this is everyone, but when we filter out the ones that are less frequent and we end up with some amount of frequent shopper propensity, buyer propensity, this is the area that you would be looking at. And like I said earlier, this area here is the primary and this blue area is the secondary. And so when you total all this up, you end up with 44,000 frequent shoppers in the market, which is a lot more than 7,000. And so what this represents is that there are total 44,000 people that you could potentially sell goods and services to in this community. And so then we take this and perform what's called a retail gap analysis or a leakage analysis. It's basically a measure of supply and demand. And so what we found on the demand side is the consumer demand, aka the money that has been spent by these 44,000 people, is over $500 million. So then we look and see, all right, well, how much did Hamilton contribute to this? Basically saying, we know they spent it, we've got the receipts, we know the money was spent, how much did they actually spend here? And what we find, it's a lot less, about $200 million. And so when you subtract these two, you end up with a total retail leakage of a little over $300 million. And so what this represents here is the opportunity that exists. And so what the consumers have all said is, we want to spend money. And one thing I've learned in doing this for 10 years is that the only thing that you can change is where they spend it. You can't change people spending money. If they want a new pair of shoes or if they want a new TV, they're going to buy it. The only thing we could potentially change is where they buy it. So rather than them driving to Tupelo to get these goods and services, let's keep them right here shopping in Hamilton. And so that represents, there's $330 million of opportunity here to recapture those dollars that have leaked out of the community into other markets. And it's a pretty safe bet here to say that a lot of this ended up in Tupelo. I was laughing, we saw someone that was at the morning session, so we were coming back from lunch, and I was telling him that Tupelo can't spend the money fast enough. They're trying to figure out how to spend the money that they're getting in tax revenue, just because they build sidewalks and 2 years later they're ripping them up and rebuilding them. But it's because they have billions and billions of dollars of retail spending there that turns right into tax revenue. And this contributes to that. So when we break it down even further, and we break it out in our formal report into about 70 sectors, but when we look at things like restaurant leakage, this represents just the amount of money that left the community for people going out to eat. And when you think about it, 44,000 people, 40 million is not a huge chunk of change, But when you think about your own spending habits and the amount of times that you went out to eat in the past year, this is on an annual basis, you can kind of see how 44,000 people took $40 million over to Tupelo and spent it at Longhorn, Olive Garden, Outback. So we found that virtually all of those in the retail trade area dined at a sit-down family-style restaurant the past 6 months. And so then when there's a lack of sit-down family-style restaurants here, like I said earlier, they're going to find what they want and they're going to go somewhere else where they have that. Even if you had some, you know, there has to be enough variety to be able to fill up a week if someone's used to eating out 4 or 5 times a week. I know I do. And so that's where, you know, the worst thing that can happen for a restaurant sometimes is what we call burnout. And that's where when you only have a finite amount of restaurants, it's actually detrimental as that restaurant owner, because as soon as someone gets burned out on your food, because they've been eating there 5 times a week, you've just lost a customer. And so in that sense, competition's good, because the more variety you have, the less chance there is that someone's going to get burned out on your food and come back next week on the same day versus having to eat it 5 days a week. We looked at grocery leakage. Nearly $38 million in groceries leaking out of the community. And this is one of those sectors where even if you have a grocery store, maybe they're just not selling all the goods and services that people, you know, would expect. And so, you know, we've seen a lot of healthy competition in the grocery sector, but the example I gave this morning was we did a project in Oxford, Mississippi. We were working for Kroger on this, and I did an analysis that would show all the people at Kroger and all the people at Walmart, and what we found is they really don't compete that much, because they're located on opposite sides of town, and what was happening is people were going to Walmart and buying all their dry goods, and then driving all the way across town, probably 15 minutes, to buy their wet goods, meaning their meats, deli items, things like that. So they were patronizing both businesses, but effectively what they were saying is, we like the good, cheap prices of cereal and bread at Walmart, but we're not buying our steaks there. We're driving over to Kroger, 15 minutes later, they got their steaks and they went home. And so that just represents where, you know, some of these businesses they might be patronizing may not be in the city limits. They might be shopping for some things here, but then leaving the market to get the other things they did not buy here in Hamilton somewhere else. And so when we talk about this sort of buying habits or what have you, we call this psychographics, and really this is an extension of demographics, the sort of information the census collects. And what it really represents is consumer behavior. So there are data sources and credit card transactions, consumer spending surveys, things like that, as well as this company I'm sure y'all will recognize, Experian, the credit reporting agency. We have line level data that shows what these people are doing, what they're spending money on, so that we can really drill down to what do these people like to do, what is their lifestyle like, what do they like to do, what do they not like to do. And so this gets rolled up into 67 total segments, and I'll give you a few of the highlights from some of the primary ones that we found right here in Hamilton. One of the first things that we know is that consumers are more concerned with cost than with quality. And it's not that quality is not important, but at the same time, cost is the most important. And so these are consumers on a budget, and they're probably not going to pay top rate for the latest brand. They're going to shop around and find whatever they can find for the cheapest that is a decent quality that they'll accept. And as I said, this is one of the recommendations I gave this morning to our local businesses. Is saying that maybe price match. You know, that's the big thing right now, is how do you compete with online where they do ultimately have better prices. And you may not make, you know, $1 million on this sale, but if you've retained a customer, and I think that's the best way to look at it, is the fact that, all right, you may not have made the margins you're used to, but if you price match, that kept that person from going on Amazon or Walmart.com or some of these other websites to get a better price. They're also very family oriented. And one of the things that we talked about this morning was having a little bit of something for everybody. Not just one member of the family, but having something at your place of business that really caters to everyone in the family, because it is such a family-oriented community. This is something that we've done work for AutoZone. This is something that AutoZone would care about. Consumers are more inclined for DIY projects here, and the reason that's important to someone like AutoZone is because they sell to people who work on their cars. And so obviously you're not going to see an AutoZone in Brookline, Massachusetts. Their household income's there about $220,000 a year. These people just don't work on their cars. And so then it's not fruitful for AutoZone to locate in a community where people don't work on their cars when all they sell are things that help people work on their cars. But what we found here is that consumers, and this goes towards home improvement projects, working on your car or what have you, but they are more inclined for DIY type projects, which is important to note because you need to know who the consumer is in order to potentially attract a business here that would want to capitalize on this. Often participate in outdoor activities such as hunting and fishing. Bob, I know, loves to fish, and so you've got to understand what the consumer is doing and who the consumer is in order to cater to that person. And this is something that the national brands need to know. So obviously we're not going after someone that would not be a fit here, but someone that might sell ATVs or someone that might sell outdoor equipment would be a really good fit here based on this information. Convenience is super important. That means that they're not willing to park down the street half a mile and then walk to this place of business. There has to be adequate parking and things like that because they want things to be convenient. The purchase they're going to make has to be an easy one. If it's not easy, chances are they're not going to make that purchase and the business will suffer. They prefer a one-stop shop method of shopping. That means not necessarily carrying everything, but don't make them go to 8 different places if they're in the market to buy something. And that's where, just carrying maybe one additional item might make that customer more likely to come back to your place of business because they know when we get here, we've only got to make 2 more stops instead of 8. And so really figuring out what your consumers are looking for and being able to cater to them with what they're looking for when they're looking to buy it. So that's just kind of an overview of the data portion. And we're going to move on after questions to more of the recruitment aspect and the part that ultimately matters if you are a property owner or a local developer. But just on the data front, is there any questions on that before we move on? Awesome. So now we get into what we mainly do, besides the data and the market analysis that we do, but what we do on a daily basis as far as talking to the retailers we talk to. So when we go out to these trade shows, typically who we're meeting with are what's called site selectors. And so what I want to kind of drill down is who these people are and why it's important to know what they see, what they like to see, what they don't like to see, that sort of thing. It varies by company, but a lot of the times these site selectors are, in a lot of the cases that I've been in, kind of glorified property managers. And so very little of their day is dedicated towards new development. A lot of it is dealing with their existing developments and their existing stores. When someone backs into a pole that wasn't painted yellow or something like that, they're having to deal with these problems. And so then they don't have a ton of time to dedicate towards new development. And so what that means for us, and even the property owner, is that you have to make everything very easy and very efficient for them because they don't have a lot of time to start with. And the last thing that any of us want to do is to waste their time. And so what we try to do when we're at these trade shows is make sure that all of our homework's done. I've met all of you. I know the properties that are available. I know what the city's willing to do. I know what they're not willing to do. I know what the numbers say. Basically having our act together so that when we get in front of them, we're able to say, hey, here's what I got. Tell me what you think. And so, and it's not that they're not concerned with new development. Believe me, they are. But there's other things that inundate them that allow them or don't allow them to spend more time on new development. And that's where we really, everyone in this room has to have everything that we need together so that when they are interested, we can make it happen like that. They like cities that are easy. They like to work in areas that are easy. The work that we've done for AutoZone, one of my good friends there, he covers the entire West Coast. And so everywhere from Washington through California, he's got Alaska. I hear nothing but horror stories sometimes about the things that he has to deal with in California. And it's not that California's a bad market. They make tons of money there. But it's just the hoops he has to go through to get a deal done. And his philosophy is, their AutoZone's going to do about 180 stores. He's got to do 40 of those. His goal is to get them open and get those cash registers open so that they can make their money back. And so the quicker they can make that happen, the happier he is. And so we are all about making this easy and quick for them. And that has a lot to do with why we're here today meeting all of you, is so that when I do have interest, it's like, all right, let's do this thing. So here's some things that can really slow down retail development. Some of these will be relevant to you guys, some not so much, but just 5 things that can really slow down development. One is not knowing the retailer's site criteria. And this can go across the board between demographics, not knowing your consumer, or just having a parcel that's 22 acres and all they need is an acre, but you're not willing to subdivide. Those can definitely halt development. Know what you've got and know who you're selling it to, because then they're going to know, hey, this has got legs, or this doesn't pencil, and they're going to go on to the next deal. That's just how they work. And so really knowing, do you have the consumers they're looking for? Do you have the land that they're looking for? Does it have adequate utilities or infrastructure? Having all that information on the front end helps us do our job, helps the city do their job, helps the retailers do their job. Not knowing your site. So what this means, and there's a lot of different variations of this, but if there's been a dry cleaners or a gas station on it, or if there's tanks buried, please know that. And I'm not saying you've got to go out there and get a phase 1 or a phase 2 done this afternoon, but know if there's any type of environmental issues. We were working on a deal in Washington once, Washington State, and there was it was with AutoZone. We were working for them, and there was a burrowing owl that they found remnants of. They never found the owl, but they found remnants, and it halted development for a year. And so they had to wait, because of the study that they did, they had to wait by state law, I think, for a year to see if the owl came back. And all it did was just waste everyone's time. And so the deal ended up happening, but it left a bad taste in the retailer's mouth, just because they had this thing they thought was going to pencil really quickly, and then found out that there's some environmental factors that go beyond having oil or chemicals on your land. It's having a creature that you've got to make sure by state law is not going to come back in the next year or whatever the period of time was. And so knowing things like that are good for us to know, to deliver that information to us, and also to let the retailers know, just so they're not caught by surprise with any of this. Not having a plan for necessary infrastructure, and this can go back to the city, this can go, depending on who's paying for it. If you know they're going to need a road, or if you know they're going to need sewer or whatever, just have a plan on how we're going to pay for it, or who's going to pay for it. So you don't have to go out there and start building it, but if they say, all right, it doesn't have this, doesn't have that, at least have a plan for how you're going to get it to them. Because if I walk in, say with a truck stop that wants to build, and there's no water, there's no sewer, there's not even a road to the property, there's 3 things at least I've got to get done and paid for before they'll even entertain this. And so I'm not saying you have to go out there and build it speculatively, but at least know how you're going to do that should that moment ever come. This one won't really affect y'all as much, just because this is something that is more common in more dense areas, especially out west, but having really complicated zoning or restrictions or overlay districts, we've seen it all. And so all that does is it puts another barrier in between no development and development. And so I'm not saying that it's impossible. The retailers deal with it all the time, and we deal with it all the time, but at the same time, you don't want to put any more steps in between empty land and a store being built. And so this is just an example of cities sometimes putting more steps in between, the process of first talks to actually getting this thing built. The last one, it just goes back to some of the feedback we've gotten from retailers, but trying to advise a retailer on the highest and best use for a site. There was a client that we had in, I wouldn't say the city, but it was in the central part of Mississippi, and the mayor said to me that there was an existing business, it was a grocery store, they wanted to do a fuel station on a plot of land. They didn't own the parcel, and they wanted to buy it, and they could buy it to make it a fuel station. But the mayor said, no, we don't want you doing that, because that needs to be a Panera Bread. I'm not making this up, I promise. It sounds outlandish, but I'm not making it up. And so they refused to let the transaction take place because the mayor thought that it was best suited for Panera Bread. And so that parcel still sits vacant today. I'm pretty sure no one even called Panera Bread. And then on top of that, the fuel station did not get built. So then the city just lost all that revenue because there's a vacant parcel of land that the mayor thought should be a Panera Bread that could have been generating income for the city and for that property owner. But, you know, that's just an example of people that get in the mix that try to tell the retailer what they think it needs to be. And I can promise you, the retailers know best. They didn't, you know, these Fortune 300 and 500 companies didn't get to where they are by being wrong. And so then you have to take into consideration if AutoZone builds 180 stores a year, some of them may not be the best stores, but they've got something figured out. And so just, you know, giving them the reins enough to be able to decide, hey, this is a good use for this, but it's not a good use for that. That's something that I would entrust them to be able to decide. This is actually, usually I'm not as close to home to be able to show something that y'all might know, but being in Hamilton, this is actually in Tupelo. And so y'all might have actually passed by this in the past. But this is the Panda Express that's on Gloucester Street in Tupelo. I always use this all over the U.S., and most people don't know where Tupelo is, but y'all would. This represents a terrible, terrible planning. I don't know if it's by the city or just the property owner or the developer, but this is the Panda Express. This was taken at lunch. This is an aerial. I have a timestamp, and so this was taken at lunch. But what happened here is they put a right in, a right out on the busiest street in the entire town, besides the interstate. And there's no curb cut on the backside. So the only way to get in this is turn right and turn right out. So if you work down here and you're trying to get in and out of there on your lunch break without making an illegal turn left out of there, there's really no way for you to get back in time. Because I can promise you, having been there, it'll take you 30 minutes to go up here, turn back around, and then get going south again. And so really, there's a traffic light here that has a protected left turn. All it would have taken is better planning and having a curb cut off the back of this parcel here. But that didn't happen. And as you can see, I count 1, 2, maybe 3 cars in the parking lot at lunch. And so these things can be prevented, again, by doing the 5 things, you know, that slow down development. Have a good plan for how you're going to, you know, structure this. And the retailers know too, but whoever at the city approved this or didn't approve it or whatever happened, this is a debacle. I challenge you, since y'all are so close, next time you're in Tupelo, see how busy that Panda Express is. Because it's not, I mean, think about it this way. At the end of the day, it's not going to be good if you sell this property, that business locates, and then goes out of business. Because then we've got yet another empty space to deal with. And it's even harder then because once the building's built on it, all right, well, so now we're looking for a restaurant tenant. Back when it was just a parcel of land, we put anything on top of it. But now we've got an empty restaurant that lasts all of 12 months, and we've got to get rid of that now. So, flip side to all this, here are 5 things that can really speed up retail development. And it's kind of just a counter to what we were talking about earlier. Knowing your demographics, knowing your consumer, knowing who's going to patronize this business that you're trying to locate here. Having a plan. This can be site-wise, or having a good site plan, or having plans for infrastructure needed, or having monies allocated for whatever improvements they're going to need. I mean, there's a plethora of things that have to happen in order for development to take place, but really having a plan for that. And it doesn't have to be written in stone. I mean, anything can change, but at least start with having some type of plan and knowing what direction everything is headed, versus having a conversation with someone for the first time and not really knowing anything, of what to tell them or anything about your site, etc. The city being connected with the stakeholders, and that's a lot of what we're doing here today, is to make sure that the city and the stakeholders in the community really have that relationship, because one hand washes the other. As soon as something locates here, that's tax revenue right back into the general fund, which is great for the city. And so having that relationship and working with the city and vice versa really allows development to be fruitful for all parties. And that's where, there might be needed infrastructure. There may be things that the mayor can help with or the council can help with on that. But having that dialogue and having that relationship with the city, and the city having the relationship with its stakeholders, really does make things happen. And I've seen it both ways. I worked in 30 states and 400 cities, and I can assure you, the places that are thriving, the cities there have the relationship with their constituents and stakeholders. Again, this goes back, kind of tying back into number 2, having monies allocated, or at least having a plan for how you're going to pay for something. And this could be on the private side or the public side. But if you know that you've got to build a quarter-mile of road, well, you've got $1 million project right there. If you got a 3-lane road and a quarter-mile, at best, you're looking at $1 million right there. So who's going to pay for that? How are you going to pay for it? Is the city paying for it? Working all of that out, even before talking to a retailer, sometimes changes the tone of the conversation. Because then you're not wasting their time. If they know that they need a road to get to the property, then that's going to be the first thing out of their mouth is, well, where's the road? Well, we don't have one yet. Do you have any plans to get one, or who's going to pay for it? Can the city help out with that, county, what have you? The city is dedicated to working with the retailer and making things easy, and this also applies to the property owners. If you can make it easy and profitable for them, they'll do it no matter what. That's just how the world works. Everyone's in it for the same reasons, and that is to make money. And so as long as you can deliver something to them that makes them money, and it doesn't take them 2.5 years to get a deal done, they'll do it every time. But there's a lot of ifs in there. And so that's where you guys come in. I'm not asking anyone to give their land away, but be realistic with what, your property's worth. And we're not brokers. I don't broker deals. At the end of the day, we put the parties together and work with affiliated brokers to do the deals. But I will say, I'm never going to tell you what I think it's worth, and it's ultimately worth what someone's willing to pay for it. But I can tell you certain prices get deals done quicker than other prices. And we see a lot of property owners sometimes that the adage I always use is, you want a little bit of something or a whole lot of nothing. And I've seen a lot of property owners getting a whole lot of nothing. And so I'm not one of those. I own rental properties, and at the end of the day, I mean, there's months where the rents fluctuate, and it's not ideal, but I'd rather have someone in there paying me something than I would have someone not in there paying me nothing. Know your elevator pitch, and we have ours, and I'm sure the mayor has his, but really, if someone were to walk up to you and say, tell me about Hamilton, have something ready to go. And that's something that we practice as we're out in the field, but something that I think the city can also practice and the constituents can also practice, is having, if an out-of-towner comes in and says, hey, what do you know about this? You don't always know who these people are. That's one thing that we laugh about, because a lot of times when I'm traveling, I'll go sit at a restaurant or a bar or whatever, and I'll ask people that, that are near me, well, what do you think about this town? Or, what is there to do here? And it amazes me the number of times that people say something negative. And I'm just thinking, you have no idea who I am, and no idea who's sitting next to you or whatever. And it's not like it's their own prerogative, but have a positive attitude about where you live and express that when someone doesn't know about it and you're ready to tell them about it. Don't tell them the worst parts of the town. Because I can assure you, AutoZone, Kroger, a lot of these businesses that we work with, they don't walk in a shirt that says AutoZone or Kroger. They look, they might have a t-shirt and shorts on and flip-flops. They're there to do work, and they're driving around looking at properties. But when they walk into a restaurant, the first thing out of someone's mouth is like, oh, we hate this place. That's not a good way to entice businesses to come. Be realistic. This goes back to pricing. This goes back to, you're not getting Saks Fifth Avenue here. I'll put that on the record right now. Nordstrom's is not coming. So be realistic with who might come and who might be interested in your property, and also realistic on what they might be willing to pay. I can assure you, AutoZone, some of the prices I've seen them pay in California are astronomical. I don't know how they do it. But they're probably not going to pay the California price in Hamilton. And so that's where, until you find that pot of gold sitting on there, it may not be worth $1 million like you think it is. And so just having a realistic expectation of what you think it's worth and what you're willing to accept. Obviously, everything's negotiable. I've seen retailers pay a lot of money for properties, and so it's not that they're cheap or trying to nickel and dime you. What they have to do, I think what's really important is even the ones that we meet with are not the decision makers. So when I meet Brian Doherty at AutoZone and Christina Dixon at Kroger, what ends up happening there is that when they approve a site, they send it or they go before their real estate committee. And so usually that's 3 to 5 people. They also have to convince that this is where they need to build their next store. And so then you're not dealing with the end all, you're dealing with the person that's got to take it up the ladder to the next step. And so, give them something that is realistic where when they walk in front of their real estate committee, they're not going to laugh at them and say, well, that's just impossible. We were trying to work on a deal in West Tennessee, and there was an old Napa Auto Parts building. It was a nice building, but I think they wanted like $2 million for this building. It was maybe 7,500 square feet. It was just ridiculous. For Paris, Tennessee, I'll tell you where it was. It was a tiny little town, but $2 million. And we were working on a deal, I think it was with PetSense. It was a pet supply company. And, they just laughed. I mean, and they weren't trying to be rude, but they're like, $2 million for this in Paris, Tennessee. And that deal didn't get done. And as far as I know, the building's still vacant. And so just be realistic. We're not asking anyone to give anything away, but, again, you want a little bit of something or a whole lot of nothing. Think outside the box. We worked with a client one time, and I don't even know the legality of this, but they were trying to help the developer out, and the city ended up letting the developer use the city's dump trucks to haul some of their, I guess they did a demo or some site prep, and they used the city's dump trucks. Save the developer about 75 grand. I don't know if that would pass muster in Alabama, but at the end of the day, that just represents, I'm not saying to do that, but I'm saying that that's thinking outside the box. If that $75,000 was to make it or break it for that deal, whatever it takes, it got the deal done, they sold the property, the business got built, and so it was a win-win for everyone involved. But we don't see cities thinking enough outside the box, and that's where we try to really invigorate everyone and really get them to thinking creatively on how we can make X, Y, and Z happen. Any questions on any of that? You're a quiet bunch.
Oh, I guess with land owners being here, maybe they would want to know in the future as things develop, some of the kinds of companies that you think might be well suited for Hamilton, so they would know if they own properties that might fit with those. What are we recruiting basically, Casey?
So, on the record, the way I'll choose to address that is I can tell you what some of their criteria is.
Yeah.
And so,
just tell us as much as you can about those.
I will. And so, if you're, say, a home improvement store, typically we're working on one of those right now in central Mississippi. The total development that we're working on there is going to be about $65 million, so it's a pretty large development. That particular development is about 35 acres, I believe, maybe just shy of 40. And so it's much larger, and what we're doing there is it's centered around this home improvement store. It has an out parcel for a grocery store. It's a smaller format grocery store. It's more of a discount brand. It's very popular right now. And a few out parcel restaurants, both sit down and fast food, and then a little bit of leasable space in line with the home improvement store. And so that total development's around, I think, 35 to 40 acres. Of that, grocery store will be taking about 2 acres. And so they only need like a very small out parcel. It's on a hard corner. And so 2 acres is plenty for them. Main thing with grocery stores is adequate parking. So if you don't have enough to give them adequate parking, it's probably going to be a no-go for them. For the home improvement store, if it were standalone, I've seen those as small as 10 acres. And so then if there was nothing else that needed to be built around it, or if we could work out where there's places for others to go, 10 acres, it could be done. There's a prototype that I've seen. Actually, I know the guy that did it in New Albany, Mississippi. He's a friend of mine. He did a prototype there that's 80,000 square foot. And so it's for Lowe's, and they normally do, give or take, 105 to 110,000 square feet. Since it's a smaller market, they're actually able to do an 80,000 square foot store and do just fine. So it's not going to be, they don't have a ton of product, and they don't have like, you know, as much selection as you would find in a place like Tupelo. But it allowed them to enter the market, kind of manage their risk of how much they're going to build and how big it's going to be. Obviously, all that costs money. And so they did an 80,000 square foot prototype there, and that may have fit even on to less than 10 acres. And so that's a good general size there. Your Walmarts and Targets, those types of retailers, you're typically looking at minimum for 14, 15 acres. It depends on the site as well. That's another thing to keep in mind. You got to keep in mind with some of these big boxes, they have to build their retention pond somewhere. And so if you're landlocked and you've got, even if you've got the amount of land, if they can't work the water or their retention pond where it needs to go, it's still going to be a no-go. And that's why I said earlier, having a plan, knowing for that type of business what they're going to have to do, and we can help with that, but really knowing how they operate and what they're looking to do and how they're going to have to lay out the site would really help you to narrow down, well, this person is definitely a good fit for this site, or maybe this person is not a good fit for this site. The fast food restaurants, they get smaller and smaller by the day. And so they were already small even before COVID happened, and after COVID happened, they went from, you know, a 1,500 square foot dining room to now no dining room at all, and just basically a lobby if you want to walk in, but then having 3 drive-throughs. And so that's kind of the model now where they're shrinking. And so what we've noticed there is they're buying the same amount of land. So if you're Zaxby's, and that's another company we work really closely with, they can do that on a little less than an acre. But they were doing the same thing before COVID. The only difference is that actual like restaurant has gotten smaller. So you're still buying the same amount of land, you're just having a smaller interior space for customers to come in, just because most of them throughout COVID were in the drive-thru anyway.
We used to hear about developments that would have what's called an anchor, and then a lot of people would want to be building. Is there any such developments as that going on now?
There's definitely, out of the ones that I named,
And would Hamilton be fitting?
I think that
an anchor with
all of the types of stores that I named, I think are adequate fits for this size market and could be located here. I think the best way to go about it is to find out how much synergy you can get from one single development instead of spreading it out. And so that's what we're doing in Central Mississippi right now in that development, is being able to parlay all the interested parties into a larger site instead of trying to cherry pick, all right, well, I need 10 acres here, 8 acres here, 2 acres here. It's not that that can't be done, but like you were saying, the home improvement store becomes your anchor. You have some leasing tenants, like some of the ones that we work with are TJ Maxx, Hobby Lobby, Ross, Maurice's, some of these like, you know, soft good retailers. And so you can parlay that into a larger development where the anchor is that home improvement store, but there's leasable space as well as space for your grocery store, out parcel restaurants, and whatever else is a fit. And so that's one of the things I'll be trying to discern today is, you know, where's all the property and all the property owners, you know, right now, and is this a workable site for X, Y, and Z? Now keep in mind, a lot of our discussions are confidential, and we typically don't give out names. It's just, you know, I can tell you home improvement or restaurant or fast food restaurant, that sort of thing.
You mentioned this morning in our discussion about people liking to shop and have convenience while they shop. I'd like to hear you elaborate a little more on that with the developers that are here today, as far as your concepts of a store being not only able to meet the needs of the people, but what they expect when they get there. Shopping experience, something pleasant, want to bring them back, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so retail right now is extremely experiential, and I'll send it to the mayor so he can pass it around to the group, but it's on one of our clients. They have a blog. It's the West Tennessee Industrial Association. And I wrote this after a trade show once talking about how retail is currently very experiential. And what that means is people my age and younger are wanting more than anything an experience when they go shop. And that's why it's not enough now to go in a coffee shop or to even go in a truck stop and get a cup of coffee. They want soft couches. They want, you know, big lounge chairs. They want things besides coffee that they can also buy, music playing, and you know. And so now it's all about that experience and cultivating something that someone would ultimately want to go and spend time at. It's, you know, at the end of the day, I think becoming a destination is probably the most important thing that any business owner or any city could ever want, is to become that destination for those types of things. And so, you know, I think the example I gave this morning was shoes. Well, you know, if you want to become a shoe destination, you've got to work with other shoe stores in that same area. And hopefully there is more than one. That would be a no-go if you were the only one, because you get in the first shoe store, they don't have your size or anything you like. Rather than leaving the market and going to Tupelo, have another shoe store. All right, well, they didn't have it, maybe this one will. And then another one right behind that. That way, you've become the destination for shoes. And you can't do that with just one business. You have to do that with multiple businesses that in theory might compete. But once they, and I think I said this morning, once they arrive in Hamilton, half the battle is won. Half the battle is getting them here in the first place. But once they're here, we have to sell them as much as humanly possible. Because then, if we don't, that's how you end up with that $300 million in Tupelo. And so really the goal is to capitalize on the things that we know people want and need. Obviously, some of the things I put up there, groceries, restaurants, even building materials. And so these are some leakages that are really on the high end of the spectrum. And so what we've got to cultivate is Hamilton's got to become the place where you can go and get these things without having to leave and go somewhere else. And so part of that will be recruiting in new businesses, but also for existing businesses to be able to step it up and also provide some of these things. Because I think there's even businesses in town now that could be selling more goods and services than they currently are, that helps new retail, that helps existing retail. And so both of those, one hand washes the other. It does nothing but help when you have new businesses coming in, because then you're a destination for one more place. And it may not be enough to keep them here, but at least we're working towards the right direction of keeping people here versus saying, well, we just don't have a store that sells that. Or if we do, we've only got one of them.
Several of the people who have come this afternoon have already sold parts of their property for commercial development. Some have owned lots of properties that were more for residential needs of the city and provided housing for a lot of people. And others now have...
That the project that we're advertising is feasible, because they're going to have that all that information for the banks anyway. And so as soon as that we get that completed, we'll be able to market to hotels, and it sounds like
that'll be soon.
Mayor's on board for it, so yes.
Okay, thank you.
So what can you see for the next 5 years?
For the next 5 years, I think some of the sectors that I mentioned, grocery, restaurants, home improvement, are probably the top three. I think those are realistic expectations.
Like any particular ones?
I can't say particular names. That's out of our comfort zone and out of our the trust that the retailers have in us.
So this development that you talked about a cluster, so what area of Hamilton do you think that it would go in?
That's where we'll have to have some discussions today about, you know, who's got property and who's willing to sell said property.
I mean, based on what's already here now, where would it go? Would it go in the downtown area or out on the interstate?
We'll have to take a look at that. That's where I don't want to be definitive in saying where I think it should go, because at this point in the game, it's going to boil down to who's willing to sell their property and what they're going to want for it. Because if, at the end of the day, you could put it in the best part of town and the best lighted intersection, but if you want $12 a square foot for it, it's not going to happen.
Well, Bobby mentioned something about the industrial park. And so what do you see going out on that in the town in the next 5 years? Because there's already the jail going out there.
I think if this works out what the mayor's talking about, potential new business going out there. If there's more jobs out there, there's going to be more people out there that need a shop. And so, it's kind of chicken or the egg, but those people have to be there in order for someone to make a decision on whether or not they're going to trust those people to patronize their business. So if you're a restaurant, they're not going to make a decision on, hey, we think there might be 200 more jobs or whatever the number is out there. They would want to see that those jobs are created and those will be created, and then make the decision, well, then these people need to eat lunch somewhere. And so I know that citywide, I'll be definitive on this, there's a need for restaurants. I don't think there's a particular part of town that restaurants are better suited. I think that there's definitely a void in the restaurant sector. And so no matter which direction you go, I think it would be suitable for restaurants. I can't say the same for home improvement, and I certainly couldn't say at this point for a hotel, but we'd have to take a look.
So you don't think there's a need for home improvement?
No, I do think there's a need. I couldn't say for sure at this point which part of town that would be best suited in.
Especially though if you do any kind of anchor development, like say there is a home improvement store or something bigger where there are also other tenants in the same development, locationally, it's not really going to matter which specific location it's in. So it really does kind of become a numbers and cents game at that point, because where can the retailer make the most money on their square footage, or wherever the land is the most affordable. And so the traffic becomes, I think, that the population will, if there's a new development or a new home goods store, then they're going to go there. Or if there's a new restaurant on one end of town, they're now going to that end of town. So that's what's neat.
A lot of towns our size have a family restaurant like Golden Corral, and they talked to me twice about my property.
Golden Corral, they'd have to do about $10,000 a day in sales, and that's really what would boil down to there.
Would they not do that much in Hamilton?
I'd have to look at Golden Corral specifically.
I think you should.
And these are things that there's no name that's been thrown out there today that we haven't looked at or that we're not currently looking at, but it's not just enough for one business to plop down and say, all right, this is our end game. We're working on trying to put multiple businesses together and have multiple success, because like Laney's talking about, having an anchor development by a home improvement store, we're building room, if we're able to get the land that we need, for a potential out parcel restaurant in which Golden Corral might be a fit. And that way, instead of us trying to locate one business, we're potentially locating three.
Well, don't you think a family restaurant would do better in our town?
Yeah, that was in the PowerPoint.
As opposed to just a standalone restaurant, catered to.
According to our data, it shows that virtually all of those in the retail trade area have dined in a family-style sit-down restaurant in the past 6 months. And so yes, 44,000 people have said we want a sit-down family-style restaurant. And so that's verifiable. Whether I know anything about Hamilton or not, our data stands alone in the fact that we can verify, all right, this amount of people have dined at that type of restaurant in the past 6 months. The problem is they've dined outside of Hamilton for a lot of that and spent $40 million somewhere else. But we try to cover more ground than just saying, all right, we're just going to recruit this business. We try to work in all the possibilities so that, shoot for the stars and, it might hit the moon or whatever the saying is.
Not that.
Not that one. I butchered that. What is it? What is the saying? Just shoot for the, and land amongst the stars. But yeah, so we're looking at all these things. It really does boil down to what makes financial sense, and I can't stress that enough. For the one that we're working on in Mississippi right now that is anchored by a home improvement store, that site was chosen for the basis that that could be had for potentially the cheapest cost for the most amount of land. And the reason being is that half of it was vacant, the other half was rental homes, a lot of which are owned by people that work for the city's family. And then on top of that, we're doing a TIF there that will basically abate the price of the land. And so the total land acquisition, I think, is going to be about $3 million there. And so we're doing a TIF deal that will offset the cost of the land. And so the developer starts from the ground up at $0. And that's how that works. But that's not every situation that we encounter, and we don't necessarily start with that. But if we know that that's going to make or break the deal, then we start looking at other alternatives like incentives where the developer effectively starts with free dirt. And so there might be ways in which we could even look at that here, but I kind of have to know what's available and what everybody wants for their land to even know how to go to the next step of doing something like that.